War Machiner presents Battle of the Bulge, the bloodiest American battle of World War II. When we talk about the Battle of the Bulge, the popular memory tends to crystallize around a few iconic images. The besieged paratroopers at Bastogne, General McAuliffe's one-word reply of nuts, and, the snow. But there is a deeper, more unsettling layer to this story that rarely gets the attention it deserves. The Battle of the Bulge was not just the largest and bloodiest battle the United States Army has ever fought, it was also a catastrophic intelligence failure that rivaled Pearl Harbor, and it exposed a fragility in the American command structure that is almost never discussed in the standard narratives. The reality is that the Germans achieved complete tactical surprise, not because they were invisible, but because the Allied high command, blinded by overconfidence and a dismissive attitude toward the Ardennes sector, ignored the warning signs. And in the chaos that followed, the survival of the Allied line did not depend on the grand strategies of generals, but on the desperate, isolated resistance of units that were shattered, surrounded, and written off. The Battle of the Bulge is, honestly, a study in what happens when a victorious army forgets that the enemy is still dangerous. The plan was Hitler's personal gamble, and, well, his own generals knew it was doomed. Operation Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine, was conceived in the mind of a dictator who refused to accept reality. The objective was audacious to the point of delusion. Smash through the thinly held Ardennes forest, cross the Meuse River, and seize the Allied supply port of Antwerp. This would, in theory, split the British and American armies and force a negotiated peace, allowing Germany to turn its full attention to the Soviets in the east. Field Marshals Gerd von Rundstedt and Walter Model, two of Germany's most accomplished commanders, both advised against it. Model privately confided that the plan, well, hasn't got a damned leg to stand on and had no more than a 10% chance of success. But Hitler was, completely unmoved. He bet the remainder of Germany's strategic reserves on a single throw of the dice, launching the offensive on December 16, 1944, with over 200,000 troops, 600 tanks, and the critical advantage of poor weather that grounded the Allied air forces. But the story of the Bulge, honestly, is not just about German audacity, it's about the forgotten units that absorbed the initial shock. While the 101st Airborne rightly earned its place in history at Bastogne, the battle was really won in the first few days by divisions that were shattered and, well, largely forgotten. The 28th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Bloody Bucket by the Germans for the red keystone patch on their uniforms, had just been mauled in the Hurtgen Forest, suffering nearly 6,000 casualties. They were understrength, exhausted, and spread across a 25-mile front, nearly 4 times the doctrinal allowance for a division. When the German offensive hit, their lines were instantly shredded, communications were, severed, and the division was broken down into squad and platoon-sized elements, fighting isolated and desperate delaying actions. They were outnumbered 10-1 in some sectors, yet they held on, trading space for time. Sergeant J.J. Kuhn of the 110th Infantry Regiment directed machine gun fire in the village of Marnock for 2 days until a German Tiger tank finally overran his position. The 28th Division's stand at Wiltz, cobbling together units including the divisional band, bought the critical hours that allowed the 101st Airborne to reach Bastogne before the Germans could seal the ring. By the time the division was pulled off the line, its strength had been reduced from nearly 16,000 to just a few hundred effective soldiers. They were, in the end, the sacrifice that made the siege of Bastogne possible. And then there was the 106th Infantry Division, which experienced the worst catastrophe to befall American arms in the European theater. The 106th was a Green Division, newly arrived in the Ardennes to gain experience in what was supposed to be a quiet sector. They were positioned in the Schnee Eifel, a rugged area that became the epicenter of the German assault. On the second day of the offensive, the division's commander, Major General Alan W. Jones, grew concerned that 2 of his regiments, the 422nd and 423rd, were dangerously exposed. He placed a phone call to Lieutenant General Troy Middleton to request permission to withdraw them. The line was bad. Jones came away from the conversation, believing that Middleton had ordered him to hold his positions. The miscommunication was fatal. The Germans encircled both regiments, cut them off, and after days of fighting without relief, nearly 6,500 American soldiers were forced to surrender. It was the largest mass surrender of U.S. troops in World War II. A distraught Jones later lamented, "I've lost a division faster than any other commander in the U.S. Army." The tragedy of the 106th is a grim lesson in the fragility of communication, and the deadly consequences of assuming that a quiet sector means a safe one. For the soldiers on the ground, survival was not a matter of grand tactics, but of immediate small unit adaptation. The conditions in the Ardennes were brutal. The Germans had deliberately chosen the timing of their offensive to coincide with a period of dense fog, low clouds, and snow, neutralizing the Allied air superiority. For the American riflemen, this meant fighting in a near-Arctic environment. Weapons froze. Tanks had to be chiseled out of the ice. The wounded died of exposure before they could be evacuated, and frostbite and trench foot caused thousands of casualties. In this environment, the Army's centralized planning structure was useless. As military historian Michael Dubler noted, the battle illustrated the critical advantage of decentralized adaptation. Soldiers learned and adjusted in combat, developing solutions to immediate problems on their own, because there was no time to wait for orders from the rear. This was survival warfare, at its most elemental. Small groups of Americans, cut off and alone, had to decide whether to fight, flee, or hide, based on the ground truth in front of them. And then there was the chaos behind the lines, which honestly tested the psychological resilience of the entire force. Hitler authorized Operation Greif, a special mission led by the infamous Otto Skorzeny, in which English-speaking German commandos were outfitted in captured American uniforms and equipment. They drove captured jeeps, switched road signs, cut communication wires, and spread confusion wherever they went. But, their most effective weapon was fear. Word spread that German infiltrators were posing as GIs, and soon the entire American rear area was pretty much paralyzed by suspicion. Checkpoints sprang up where soldiers were grilled on American trivia. The capital of Illinois, the name of Mickey Mouse's dog, just to prove their identity. General Omar Bradley himself was briefly detained when he answered that the capital of Illinois was Springfield. The soldier questioning him was convinced it was Chicago. The paranoia slowed movements and eroded trust. For the individual soldier, the threat was no longer just in front of him, it was anywhere, wearing his own uniform. This psychological warfare, while causing minimal physical damage, inflicted maximum disruption. The battle also forced a pragmatic shift in American policy that is often overlooked: the desegregation of the front lines. With infantry losses mounting into the tens of thousands, the Army could no longer afford to keep African American soldiers exclusively in service and supply roles. The desperate need for combat troops led to an urgent call for volunteers. Some 2,500 black soldiers stepped forward, many of them fighting alongside white units for the first time in the war. The 969th Field Artillery Battalion, an all-black unit, sustained heavy casualties in the defense of Bastogne and was later awarded a Distinguished Unit Citation, the first ever presented to a black outfit. The 761st Black Panthers Tank Battalion, under General Patton's command, rolled into combat and proved themselves in the snow and mud of the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge did not end segregation in the military. That would come later, in 1948, but it cracked the door open. In the crucible of the bloodiest battle in American history, performance mattered more than prejudice. The Battle of the Bulge matters because it is a reminder that victory is not inevitable, and that the enemy always gets a vote. The Germans were ultimately defeated not by a brilliant Allied plan, but by their own strategic overreach and the stubborn refusal of American soldiers to quit. The weather cleared on December 23rd, unleashing the Allied air forces on the German supply lines and armored columns. Patton's Third Army executed a massive pivot and drove north to relieve Bastogne. The German advance ran out of fuel, out of time, and out of options, but the cost was staggering: over 80,000 American casualties, including 19,000 killed, in 6 weeks of fighting. For the student of history, the Bulge offers an enduring lesson in the dangers of overconfidence, the necessity of decentralized decision-making, and the brutal reality that in war, the best-laid plans often dissolve in the first contact with the enemy. The soldiers, who fought there understood that survival depended not on the strategy handed down from headquarters, but on the man next to them, the round in their chamber, and the will to keep fighting in the snow. If you value this kind of deep-dive, no-nonsense historical analysis, the kind that looks past the myth and into the frozen mud of the Ardennes, make sure you subscribe to War Machiner, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to understand what the largest battle in American history actually demanded from the men who fought it.